the number of startups has increased so much over the past couple of years?
I think it's just the whole ecosystem. Universities are getting a little bit more commercial and thinking the real world impact of their research. The academic career pathway is frankly very rubbish.
Could you explain sort of how something goes from an idea all the way out through that process?
Some magic big company would read that, oh, this is really great, I'm going to cure cancer or save the planet.
You know, these big sort of pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and stuff, they also have their in-house labs and develop ideas there. I discovered this concept of like patent thickets. You've experienced them.
I know they are there and they are patents are for, I suppose. I think a lot of people think patents stop innovation, but I think from what I see, it kind of really encourages it, because some of my clients, they don't want to knowingly infringe somebody else's thing.
Generally, people see a patent as a reward for creating an invention, and you then get this monopoly, which is generally 20 years.
What have you found to be like the biggest challenges that they face?
I think it's just lack of knowledge, because there's not very much in the way of training inside academia as to what their options are, no career development.
For today's conversation, we are looking at the aspects of IP, specifically in biotechnology. We're really digging into how IP happens and exists in the biotech and synbio world. And so for that conversation, we invited Sara. Sara has a background in molecular biology and then moved on to be an IP advisor. So she has this very unique ability to really understand where scientists and researchers are coming from when they do start wanting to commercialize their ideas and take it sort of out of a university setting. So welcome to our podcast, Sara. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I think a lot of people don't know the amount of sort of steps and sort of hurdles that you have to get through to go from having a great idea to like putting something on the market.
Okay. So if I talk about it from like an academic context, and my own personal experience from being an academic, and I know people think this still, was if I had an idea in academia, I would publish it in a journal. Some magic big company would read that and they'd be like, oh, this is really great. I'm going to turn this into, I'm going to cure cancer or save the planet. That's what I thought. And I think that's what a lot of people think. That's how you have impact, by publishing. But then as soon as I left, starting this job within a few months, I realised that's not how it works. Unfortunately, the world does revolve around money. Somebody somewhere has to make money to get these ideas commercialised and onto the market. So unless you've thought at that early stage about protecting your intellectual property, which from my background, it would primarily be patents in the biotechnology space, patents and trade secrets. If you haven't protected it, then you have nothing to kind of raise money on the back of from like investors. So it's very unlikely you're going to get that idea turned into something. So what tends to happen if people are thinking correctly or along the right lines is they'd have the idea, maybe they'd have a bit of data at university. They should talk to a tech transfer office, because most of the time the university will own that IP, which I think comes as a lot of shock. It's shock to a lot of people, because I have to talk to a lot of postdocs who want to go off and do something. I won't say, well, you can't, because it's not your IP, it's the university. So the university tends to own the IP. The tech transfer office will work with the academic to decide if they're going to take it forward. If they do, they will probably file a patent, which then means that the academic can publish. So it doesn't prevent this science from getting out into the world at all. You just have to do it in a certain timeline. So they would file a patent. A lot of the universities will work on a model of trying to get that intellectual property licensed out. So rather than taking that forward themselves, they will look for a partner to take that on, which is fine, because then at least it's still doing something. And then increasingly, the kind of academic scientists are founding companies, so spin outs themselves. So they would set up a company, in-license this IP, and then they're just like any other startup. They would create their intellectual property, they would get their data. They may have different models of, a lot of the ones I work with, it's kind of operating like a service model. So they're designing enzymes for different partners and things like that. Some of them will try and kind of have their own lead assets and they'll take them forward, because investors apparently seem to like, if you're a platform, they want you to also have a lead asset that they can, see the value coming from. And then I suppose, yes, if it's a therapeutic, it's got to go through clinical trials, which are very expensive. So a lot of companies will take a drug product to a certain stage and then look to either sell it, offload it to somebody who's got the resources to do the clinical trials, or some will try and fundraise and do the trials themselves and take it forward to kind of have their own product on the market.
At least, I mean, I'm familiar more with the pharma industry than the synbio industry, but, these big sort of pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and stuff, they also have their own in-house labs and develop ideas there. So I would love to know, like, do you have any idea of like what percentage of ideas are coming from university and then from these sort of privatized labs?
To be honest, I'm not sure, but I think there is quite a shift to, it's a bit like outsourcing your research, isn't it? You find these little cool companies who've got something new and then you bring that in-house. So I think that's definitely the business model for a lot of the startups, and the amount of startups has increased massively since I left the lab 10 years ago. So I think they must be looking to kind of scout this kind of new technology and bring it in-house.
Why do you think the number of startups has increased so much over the past couple of years?
Why? So when I left the lab, to me, it was either stay as a postdoc, go and work in industry, which to me meant big pharma, repetitive work, really boring. I wouldn't have enjoyed it. Now I think it's a choice of you can go and work in one of a million different little startups that they just weren't there. So it's probably a combination between. I think it's just the whole ecosystem. Universities are getting a little bit more commercial and thinking more kind of about the real world impact of their research. Certainly, I think there's quite a big movement, and which I'm fully supportive of, within academia, that the academic career pathway is, frankly, very rubbish, put it mildly. And I think people are looking for ways in which to pursue their research or stay in science outside of academia and have that impact. I think there's, most of the people I work with, they're not founding companies to make millions of pounds, they're founding companies to get that technology out there. And hopefully for them, they will make some money as well. But yeah, most of them are not financially driven. It's this kind of getting the technology out there.
Okay. And sort of in your work with startups, what have you found to be like the biggest challenges that they face trying to, bridge this gap out of academia?
To get out of academia, I think it's just the lack of knowledge, because there's not very much in a way of training inside academia as to what their options are, no career development, kind of, just based. I spend so much of my time, me and one of my colleagues would do so many basic IP talks to academic universities or kind of little accelerators, and people always say, why are we not taught this early on? Why are we not taught the basics? Because, don't go and talk about it at a conference if you want to try and protect it. It doesn't mean you can't talk about it after. I suppose a lot of them are doing it when they're quite younger. The thought of me setting up a company now with absolutely no financial backing behind me is terrifying. But, it's a big thing, I suppose, to leave one position, start a company with no money. You've got to fundraise and you've got to pay yourself at some point for some of the work. And I suppose specifically, I think it's probably different for tech. In the biotech world, you need a lab, you need some data. That's not cheap. It's not like you can set up in some people have set up in their garage with their little labs, but it's not common to kind of have the access to equipment. From what I know of decentralized science, I really like the decentralized movement. Personally, maybe we could talk about this. I don't know how it has to tie with blockchain and things, but kind of, I feel like there should be more decentralized labs, sharing of academic resources, because they're in the universities, all these resources, people should be able to access them to get their startups off the ground a bit more. So I don't know. I think it's that early piece is quite difficult for a lot of them.
Okay, interesting. And then I think obviously this narrative around sort of like big pharma and it's out to get small businesses and that sort of thing. I definitely think it's an overwhelming narrative if you speak to most people. And while doing some research for this podcast, I discovered this concept of like patent thickets, where these bigger companies sort of with a huge bunch of like a team of lawyers and endless financial resources kind of end up trying to snap up and cover as much IP and patent as much as possible to stop people from being able to access the industry. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about what those are, if you've experienced them. And I guess really maybe speaking to, as someone who is in the trenches with this stuff, if you do feel that like these bigger companies are this omnipotent force that is really difficult for startups to face.
Yeah. Oh, I suppose that comes down to the whole point of a patent. Even just one patent is to protect as much as you can, really. That's my job, to protect for my clients as much as I can, to give them that kind of monopoly. And I'm sure some of my little baby clients would like to have a patent ticket one day, maybe. But for my clients, I don't feel like there's an impression that pharma or the big maybe ag tech companies, they're not out to get them. I'm sure my clients would like to partner with them. They're there, they've got other resources. They would like to collaborate, work in partnerships. And that's why, like, you know, people like Mark, who's going to speak in a minute, come in, because you need to get those collaboration agreements right to start off with. Who's going to own what? So there's no fighting about that later. And I guess for my clients, when we do come across patents that might be a problem for my clients, there's lots of options. They can either ignore it, because sometimes, you know, who's going to know? You ignore it, you go ahead. That's for them to decide. You can try and take a license. You can try and design around. So I think a lot of people think patents stop innovation, but I think from what I see, it kind of really encourages it, because some of my clients, they don't want to knowingly infringe somebody else's thing. So we will look at the patents that exist. They will say, well, if you did this, we think you'd probably be outside of the scope, or could you, you know, move in a different direction? So I don't know if that answers your question. I don't have much direct experience of patent thickets. I know they are there, and they are. Yeah. That's what patents are for, I suppose. But yeah.
No, I think it's helpful. I think it's helpful to like kind of view it as not the separation of like small company trying to pursue it to the end, and then big company trying to like pursue and go through the whole process. But there's actually sort of this handoff at a point where, you know, they are inclined to work together, because also then, you know, the founders or the startup sort of founders are able to get the financial resources to progress their idea. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. So I think it's helpful to see it in that way rather than this sort of quite competitive way. But I think I would love to get sort of, so first of all, Chris is also on this call with us. Chris is our IP lawyer at Molecule. He has a very diverse background in IP. He'll introduce himself in a second. But he kind of figures out the creative ways and really spends a lot of time thinking about how Molecule can help with issues in the IP biotech landscape. So Chris, I'd love if you could introduce yourself, and then maybe speak to some of the more systemic issues that you've seen in the IP biotech scene.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. So my background, I have a bachelor's degree in astrophysics, and I also I went to college in the U.S. At a liberal arts school, so you know you can study all these different things at the same time. So I studied world religions at the same time as well, and then after undergraduate school, I went and worked for maybe 7 or 8 years around the world doing kind of interfaith social justice work and things. I went to divinity school and did a master's degree in theological studies on religion, ethics, and politics, and became just very interested in kind of conflict and culture around trade and ideas at a certain level. And I can get into specifics about that as maybe they arise, but I then went to law school. I became a patent litigator. I'm a registered patent agent with my physics background, but I became a patent litigator in the big tech space, in the smartphone wars. When I sort of was coming out of law school, that was where a lot of patent litigators would get active. And so I was in private practice at Alston & Bird in Washington, D.C., litigating at the International Trade Commission, which is this kind of intense court for big stakes patent litigation. Did that for a few years and then moved out to Silicon Valley, where I did more international trade kind of patent lit in the tech space, and then joined a company called Rational Patent Exchange, or RPX, which is a very large kind of like patent risk clearing entity, largely just for big tech, but it's expanding because, for reasons we'll also discuss, the economics of the IP market lend themselves to needing entities like an RPX. After RPX, I left. Along the way, I've been experimenting a lot with ways to use IP that really help advance more progressive causes. I'm a political progressive in these ways, and I'm interested in ways to figure out how to, at the very least, make the IP system, I think, operate more fairly and address these systemic issues that I'll also talk about in a second. And in that vein, I kind of got pulled into the psychedelics space, and there's a lot of concerns now around intellectual property and biopiracy again in the psychedelic space, and what happens to indigenous people's interests who don't fit neatly into the IP system as it's framed. And with that as well, got really excited about tokenized intellectual property and what Molecule was building. And it's this technical solution that I'd kind of been looking for from some of my experimentations with IP commenting in software and in the copyright space and elsewhere. And so with this, I've just been thrilled to get to try and build essentially a legal framework for tokenized IP that can even be broader than biotech. As you can maybe tell from my background, it's not so deep specifically in biotech. It's only been recently, really through DeSci, that I've been doing some license deals and some patent protection there. But I'm particularly interested in trying to solve these structural inefficiencies and see if we can't create a system that is scalable even beyond just the biotech part of the IP economy and can integrate into copyright, trademark, and kind of what the giant prizes, if we can tokenize intangible assets more generally, is what the World Intellectual Property Organization would estimate as being about 74 trillion of the global economy. Because just in the past 40 years, Fortune 500 companies, there's been this IPification of the global economy from where it used to be about 20% of the balance sheets of Fortune 500 companies have inverted to be now about 80% in intangibles. And when I mean intangibles, I mean cash is actually in the tangible side. So fascinating. But with all of that, patent thickets, there's kind of two ways I think that are important to think about when addressing patent thickets. One is just the systemic issues of how does one create a patent thicket if one wants to inside the IP system, and what are the costs attendant to doing so? And then the flip side, what happens when people create them? What are the implications? Are they necessarily bad? And I want to begin by saying, I think patents, like all IP, they're tools, and they're especially a tool like a hammer, in as much as they're very productive to build beautiful things, I think, that are very good for society and can be very, very helpful if the person wielding it wants it to be. If you want to be destructive with it and hold up an industry, you can, patents in particular are, in my opinion, probably the most powerful tool in the global economy in order to jam things up. And you can really jam things up in a way that I think undermine the intention of the IP system when you wield it poorly. And in this vein as well, I'm want to speak a little bit to that power and how much power is there, and how can we limit that power in a certain way to maybe align our interests and stop the harm when the system is being used, through DeSci. And what that looks like, in my mind, is one, we have the structural issue of just access to the system. The patent system has never been a system that grew organically from the artisanal kind of class. It wasn't like peasants in Europe who then started to get better at making swords and things, who then said, I want patents. It was an inversion. It started really, IP in the trademark sense, in some veins, started as a kind of consumer protection around loaves of bread. But when we turn to the patent system, you see it coming more from the monarchy down, offered not even necessarily to the inventors of ideas, but more to those who were sort of held in favor with the monarch, and who had the opportunity then to have the exclusive right to commercialize an idea, bring it into service, really, again, to the advance of a kingdom, which is in the king's interest, to the advance of a whole public. But from the get-go, the costs of these patents, it may be, 2,000 pounds sterling, but like 2 centuries ago, so, just very expensive to maintain these. But this system, as it's evolved, and my experience with the system and the way I look at it is that it came out of Europe. The U.S. role in just international trade and the kind of imperial flex it can wield post World War II in the global economy helped make an American version of this IP system look more like the global standard. Out of this basis. And there's some interesting points there that arise that, again, are problematic in patent thickets. But the first issue around here is that the sheer cost of accessing the system has certainly democratized in its intention to make things much more affordable. But we're still talking, perhaps Sara has had this experience, but most patent attorneys, at least in the US, identify with this, where someone comes and says, I have an amazing idea. It's probably a golf kit or something, as is often the case with retirees and some of these funny things. But how can I get a patent on it? I really want to get a patent. And all right, well, start with 10 grand maybe, and know that if you want to enforce it, you're looking at another 100 grand, and then it might get invalidated. 50% of the patents in the US that are litigated through to the merits are found invalid. So then there are at least 110 grand out, and you start doing these economics, and they're like, well, they're ready to play with a few grand to get the leverage, right? And that's hard. And that piece in particular, along with, I think, just the lack of education we tend to have, especially as inventors. I'm an inventor on a patent as well. I have no idea. I didn't even know about IP after getting a bachelor's in physics, and didn't even know, hey, this is a cool path for someone who likes inventions and likes science, but is not going to do for a million reasons like Sara was mentioning. So anyways, to get to this instance, so the costs of accessing the system are high. There's structural bias, even at these really deep, painful, uncomfortable levels that we have to deal with culturally today. And that's that in the US, there's structural bias that tracks identity politics. If you look at Professor Anjali Vatt's work, she wrote a book called The Color of Creatorship. And among other sort of scholars in the US at law schools that are looking at critical race and intellectual property and these structural issues, it's manifest that people of color are also excluded from the market of being able to raise these funds and capital in ways that even in the US have been actively attacked. I mean, so there's troubling histories about access here. On top of this, there's also a certain epistemology that comes from the European Enlightenment tradition that brings us the IP system, but that doesn't match with the epistemology of indigenous peoples in the Americas. Oftentimes, they don't view creatorship as being something done from an individual. These models don't fit well. The cost of accessing the system to create a patent thicket here again have huge cultural costs of having to just kind of conform to this epistemology and figure out culturally how to handle it. So I first want to begin with by saying there's a cost. There's just a cultural cost and social cost and even economic cost as inventors when we engage the system. Now, let's say we get through all of that, and now we're more in the realm of what we're talking about. Patent thickets, a single patent, like Sara was mentioning, can do the harm. And famous examples of this, in 1769, James Watt gets the steam engine patent. And what does he do? He spends 31 years doing nothing but jamming up the market from further developing it. And so it wasn't until 1800 that you actually had the patent expire, and all of a sudden there was this boom, this explosion. The collaborative period boomed after this. I was looking at a note because people were so frustrated that the fact that the steam engine for 31 years was just pumping water out of the well. He had a broad claim, but that was his only utility and his only chance to market it. So we see this instance of a patent holdup that, gosh, I mean, this has climate implications today. If you get a breakthrough technology on something that can affect transportation and then you hold up the market to keep us using big oil, things like this. At a macro level, I could talk about a political economy of the IP system that sees holdups and an IP system functioning in a way that protects the big oil market in ways that maybe undermines some of the climate tech broader market. But at the same time, we use the IP system, I think, to advance the evolution of steam engines. And like Sara had mentioned, what should have happened in 31 years is all of the competitors should have designed around it. But what happens, when you get in a big enough breakthrough in one patent, you get a hold of? Well, what happens if you just get small breakthroughs, which is the more common path, but then you create a thicket so you get the same effect, right? Well, this is what happened in the 1850s with the sewing machine wars. There was just this massive patent litigation, I think 300 some lawsuits, even just between a single competitor. I mean, just a huge waste, frankly, of money that again kept the sewing machine out of what then becomes what after it ended became actually an intentional collective to develop what became a crowdsourced sewing machine, a really cool early model of decentralized science. And then all of a sudden, the sewing machine can get out to everyone's hands. This is for the lock stitch sewing machine, which, again, you're just immediately helping the whole public economy by elevating the platform. Right now, all of a sudden, you have an input technology that can just let everyone who sews kind of advance and let the whole economy advance there. A third I want to mention, because it's a hilarious example of a particular Americanness of how the system has evolved and what patent thickets look like. The Wright brothers, right? I mean, what bigger advance than the airplane? They're held up as an icon of the success of the patent system in the US. They're still on license plates in North Carolina as just, this is the success of the patent system. Well, what happened when they got their patents in 1906? They spent 8 years just litigating under a business model that was as just pure capitalist, really, as it gets, that said, I want to make this thing successful so I can make as much money as possible doing as little work as I possibly can. And so for 8 years, they stunted the development of the aircraft, such that by the time when World War I began, the U.S. was so far behind, they were flying European planes until they could get caught up. And so what happened there, it was such a national security that the abuse of the patent power was so harmful to national interests. I mean, now we even already have the law shifted. Governments will just blow through obviously, they'll blow through patents whenever they want, because who's going to stop them? But in this instance, the government at the start of World War I in the U.S. actually forced the creation of a patent pool to prevent the ongoing holdup. And then that was also what unlocked the development. So again, what's so odd about this is you're seeing a government intervention on a government created right. It's a problem of its own creation, just because of how IP sort of function in its own vein. So I mentioned all of this to kind of get to this point of saying, well, so what happens? Now you have a patent hoard, you can abuse this thing. What does it look like today? The biggest problem that we see with this today is less active in the biotech space, though it can happen, of course, and big pharma has its tactics. That's not the big threat, I think, for us to solve structurally. The big threat is the patent troll model. And it's coming into biotech because there's no future really that I see of biotech that keeps software and hardware out of an AI, out of the delivery of the service, even if it just needs a UX, some computer interface. And for reasons specific to big tech, the patent system and the way in which claims are claimed. If you get a patent on a molecule, it's very easy to tell if someone infringes or not. If you get a patent on a method for insert something that software does that maybe a computer kind of also does, and you don't know where you're litigating, you all of a sudden get this patent claim that can just be read on anything. And maybe it's on a barcode or something. It's these Wi-Fi, basic technologies that are in everything. And patent trolls buy these up. They create patent thickets that one needs in order to access a market simply by collecting this IP off of the free market. And this is why I think this is the problem to solve for, because this is the inevitable problem of all evolving markets in tech. The enforcement market becomes a liquid market, becomes a free market. So then inventors who say, I'm not going to litigate against Google to enforce, or, Apple to enforce my patent. They'll throw $1 billion at me if they want to steamroll me and do what's considered efficient patent infringement. So no, I'm going to create a patent thicket, and it's going to be a collective of inventors or people who have some common interest who can't afford to engage the structure. And then I'm going to deploy that to monetize. And that is the modern form of the patent troll. They get private capital. They're deploying these things in theory. That's the inventor side. Or they're just private equity funds who are doing this because they've learned they can make a great return. This is, I think, ultimately the thing to solve for, because what happens in this patent troll model is that you sue someone, you can file a lawsuit if, like Mark would know, if I want to file a lawsuit, obviously I can internalize those costs, get a patent myself maybe for 50 grand. It's only costing me my time and 50 grand the minute I file it and serve it on another side, because I know what I'm doing as a patent litigator. I've already cost them 100 grand if they want to get anywhere near a dismissal. And I'm going to then, let's just say, start in the US, and this is because attorneys' fees are each side, the side I sued has to bear its own costs. It's not common. And we're going to settle anyways, because if you don't settle, it's going to cost over $1 million. But you set up this situation where a side gets sued and they're like, your patent is invalid and I don't infringe. And this is nonsense, right? And so they say, I'm going to fight. I don't want to be held up. And maybe they fight one and they're 150 grand out, and then they settle for 80 grand and they're 230 grand out. And they're like, gosh, I paid my attorneys more than I settled for. So the next time comes around, settlement off, they get sued, and immediately the economically rational thing is to say, well, I'm going to settle for 85 grand right out of the gate. Cost me 85 grand, and then I haven't paid the lawyers. But where does that leave the patent troll? It hasn't learned anything other than to say, just keep suing and offer settlement costs that are just the avoided costs of litigation, right? Well, when you have a patent thicket and you have 30 patents, it doesn't even matter if they're really weak, frankly. If you want to exploit the US system, and if you're really good, you exploit it internationally by using systems where injunctions are in play rather than damages and attorney's fees so much, and you create these threats. So internationally, you hit in the US, you hit in Germany, maybe you hit in China all at the same time, and you do these things. Enormous pressure just on the threat of the litigation. And this is a huge problem. I mean, this is the problem, I think, that arises from abusive wielding of market power that comes when one has this. No, I know I'm talking a lot, but let me just conclude with one piece. The backside to this is antitrust regulations, and that's what steps in when you have market power that's being abused. We haven't seen any type of antitrust look yet at anything in DeSci, but it'll get interesting if we scale immediately and we've deployed a network, an intellectual property network. Well, all of a sudden communications, that looks something more, not like the securities regulation, but more like something that in the US, the Federal Communications Commission would want to look at and things. And so we move ourselves into a different realm too, that gets just a wild west in the new issues that arise, but all that hover fundamentally around these economics. So thanks for letting me ramble on about that. I just had a lot to say about what it unlocks.
Thank you so much, Chris. Always so interesting hearing from you. There's so many things that I was like taking mental notes of, but I think maybe the thing that I am most interested in asking about is this concept. You mentioned this concept of IP commonings, and kind of from what you were saying, I think there's this that this concept of individualism versus sort of collective benefiting off patents is kind of this push and pull, and the Wright brothers and the steam engine, who basically delayed progress for the sense of how can I use this patent to serve myself rather than how am I using this patent to protect my ideas but also use it to progress sort of the world as a whole. And so I think, for me at least, decentralized science, because you have these big decentralized communities, and you have a whole bunch of people buying into these concepts. I'd like to hope that that's maybe a somewhat of a balm for this sort of individualistic sense in patent litigation. But yeah, I know you are very into IP commonings, and so I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and I'll keep this snippet brief because I'd love to hear how Sara and Mark experienced this. And thanks, because this is a really exciting way to talk about this too. I think what our goal really should be, I think we have proof in the examples that I provided as well, that even it's called just the free market capitalist instinct here self-corrected, right? It actually was in the sewing machine wars, the community itself that just said, this is ridiculous, and self-organized to create, this crowdsourced sewing machine and to do it. We saw it with COVID as well. Immediately we said, let's go COVID pledge and let's try and pool IP immediately to just kind of solve for something. Because we also, and who participated, who put their IP in? All the Web 2 companies, right? It was just good marketing. Who didn't, because it hurts the bottom line, the pharma companies, and how we see a bunch of patent lit around COVID vaccines, which again speaks to a different point. But when it comes to commenting, and I think what we really, for us to succeed in DeSci, it's not that we need to appeal to the better nature of people, I don't think, because I as much as I'm an optimist, I don't think that actually works, especially in this market. I think what we just need to demonstrate is that it creates a better system. It's a more efficient system. We solve for what are market failures whenever we actually default a system to something that it shares, just de-risk all of this baseline 100K cost, all this nonsense. It's because of that nonsense that RPX, exists. The company I was working for and does so well because it provides patent litigation defense insurance. It aggregates big data, diffuses risk by creating risk retention groups. All of a sudden, everyone who's part of a network pools risks in order to, again, diffuse the troll and agree that they will never assert against one another as trolls. And these, about 1/3 or so of all patents in the United States are encumbered with a pledge that is part of this license on transfer network that Google created that says if this patent gets in the hands of a patent troll, one of these entities I was describing before, and is asserted against anyone else who's made a similar pledge, there's a springing license. You can't do it, so you kill the market. So again, natural market response to saying this system it's overdone. And I'm sorry, to my fellow patent litigators, especially in the US, but we're kind of the problem. $1,000 an hour, stuff we can charge. It's messed up the system. And I think also here too, there's a cool piece in IP commenting. What we need in DeSci, what we need to develop IP, what we need to build a culture of innovation that is just cheaper to manage, trustless because we're on blockchain and can vote with tokens, can see the money. But what we really need is science brains. We need the PhDs. We need Ella, Sara, Mark. We need people who understand the science, and we need people who understand how to protect and license and contract the IP. Frankly, none of that has to be a lawyer. That's in the US. A patent agent is fully authorized to apply, get the license. A patent agent can even litigate inside the patent system itself, inside the administrative court. It obviously can't practice law, but the patent, it's he or she, they, the patent agent, they can become an IP licensing expert. Many of the most sophisticated IP licensing experts in big tech, I've seen some at Comcast and others, don't have law degrees. And so there's this role for this, I think, new value proposition in the IP service economy into DeSci that really elevates the patent agent and the value proposition there and kind of diminishes what I like in biotech. Astrophysics background, I'm sorry, my only value prop is more in this other business side, and don't have to be a lawyer. I've learned it from being a lawyer, but other than negotiating tricks and then threats of litigation, I don't offer anything that new. So I think commenting has this opportunity to create not only a new economy, but also for us to just demonstrate, cooperate a little more. Let's be clear on the terms of which we cooperate. We can keep them all non-commercial. And we'll just license each other when it becomes commercial, and we'll share those proceeds. But let's cut the nonsense on suing each other for non-commercial use, strict liability, all this. It's a problem. We can do better if we collaborate privately. That's kind of the idea. But Sara and Mark, I'd love to hear if that even appeals to kind of what you've seen in the market, or if there's other market issues that are better to focus on and solve for.
Yeah, sure. So firstly, thank you for mentioning me. I haven't yet introduced myself, but I'll do that very quickly, and it's lovely to be here. So I'm a colleague of Sara's. I'm an IP solicitor, but while Chris very kindly said I had a scientific background, that's not quite right. I've got a philosophy degree and went straight out of university and started working in the late noughties for a digital publishing company, doing sort of product management for them. So quite an early stage online business, and that really developed an interest in developing tech and the internet, and in where that might go. So I retrained as a lawyer a few years later, and I've been doing this for the best part of a decade. And my practice really covers all areas of IP, but my interests as they relate to IP are in things like AI. I do a lot of work in AI, and NFTs. So I provide a lot of strategic advice to companies in these spaces, both in terms of aligning with Sara on advising early stage companies on, here's my idea, here's what I'm doing, how can I protect it, whether it's across patents, copyright, brands, whatever else it might be. But also strategically things like companies coming to me and saying, hey, I've got this idea, I need to use this massive data set, or I need to do this, or I need to do that. How can I do this? So fairly novel problems that arise as tech develops. And obviously patents are a huge part of that, both in terms of advising companies how they can protect themselves, but also in terms of advising companies when they're in a good position to go ahead with something, when they might want to rethink how they're doing it a little bit to get around infringement concerns and that kind of thing. And I think the patent thicket conversation in relation to this is a really interesting one. And I just wanted to provide a little bit more context to Chris's incredibly detailed and well put together history. I think the context I wanted to provide is what's called the patent bargain. And generally people see a patent as a reward for creating an invention. And you then get this monopoly, which is generally 20 years, over what's been invented and what's been claimed in the patent. And that's not quite right. The patent bargain really says, if you tell the world how your invention works and how to do it, then you'll get your monopoly. And so it's a reward not only for inventing something, but for disclosing how that's been invented. And therefore, there is a huge, while there are absolutely downsides, and they've been touched upon, including in relation to patent thickets, there is a huge innovation upside in patents, in that the converse to having a patent monopoly is that you keep everything secret. And then people hold their chests incredibly tightly how they've done something. So, the Wright brothers may never have patented and told the world how an airplane works. Watt may never have told the world how a steam engine works, even though he then held the market up for years. Ultimately, that put the market in a good position to progress. And I think what we've seen, through the course of the history that Chris took us through, is the law developing, albeit slowly, in a way to reflect the commercialities of the time. So, Chris mentioned what we call in the UK Crown use, what other places will call government use. If a patent is really useful or really important for defence or for government purposes, for transport, whatever else it might be, the government can say, we're going to take a license of right over that patent. Chris mentioned the development of antitrust laws, the flip side to patents, and we've seen that break up huge monopolies supported by patents, including things like AT&T in the 80s. And I think the most recent development that's really interesting in this area is what we call in the patent world FRAND, which stands for fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. And that currently largely applies to telecommunications. So if you have a standard like 4G or 5G or Wi-Fi 6 or whatever else it might be, there will be a list of patents that are seen as necessary to that standard. And the patent holder is obliged to offer anyone who wants to work within that standard a license of right on fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. So firstly, I completely agree that patent thickets are difficult for all the reasons discussed, and I completely agree that there are some bad actors out there. But I do think that the law is slowly moving in a direction that helps to provide for ways around those bad actors. And Chris touched on things like how a pharma company is going to become more and more embedded in digital and in tech. And as I think as it does so, I wouldn't be surprised to see the scope of FRAND, of fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory licenses, expand to cover more sectors than telecommunications, which is where it sits at present, and to assist in circumventing patent thickets in those areas as well. So I absolutely agree that patent thickets are worth discussing, and things like DeSci to democratize invention, to democratize research, to democratize IP ownership and protection is hugely important, and is something which today's tech allows us to do that couldn't be done in the days of the invention of the steam engine. But equally, I do think it's worth keeping in mind that patents exist in their current form with the current circumventions out of the development of hundreds of years of legal history, hundreds of years of government input, legislature, consideration of focus groups across industries, across lobbyists. And it's very easy to paint all patent protection or all IP protection as wrong, when in fact there are huge benefits out of it as well.
I think that is the first time I've really understood that convo. So thank you so much for that, Mark. I like, and actually seeing that disclosure benefit. And so I think, yeah, it's very easy to like you said, go down that path of patents incentivizing people incorrectly, but this ultimate good of sharing and disclosing information. I know you work in like AI and NFTs and stuff, and so maybe sort of zooming back into the healthcare industry, as I was at a conference, Frontiers of Health, a couple of weeks back, and it was one of these big sort of conferences, Biotech, and I was really interested to see, like, almost every single presentation was about AI in healthcare, personalized healthcare, apps for healthcare and all of that sort of stuff. And it really seems like tech is, going to be one of the next big things across the world, but it's also sort of taking over that biotech industry. And I was wondering if, you and Sarah could speak to the clients, or, I mean, obviously you can't speak about your clients, but about the experiences you've had working in biotech and AI, and if you're feeling like this is an oncoming trend.
Yeah, happy to pitch in, and then Sarah can add stuff, or vice versa, whichever's best.
You start, Mark.
Yeah, sure. So I think, I mean, the examples that immediately come to mind are people using AI in its general form, in the form that most people currently interact with, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, that kind of thing, is as a kind of handy tool in a day-to-day life, which adds some efficiency, but is not necessarily going to change the world in its current form. What I think AI is doing in specific sectors is a lot more interesting, and is a lot more of a shift. So in pharma, for example, I think we have clients who, and we see companies who use AI to review drugs that are on the market and maybe aren't doing so well, or aren't so effective, or have been overtaken, against various ailments, and consider whether a drug can be repurposed for a second or third use. And AI adds hugely to the speed and the insight that can be given in that regard. We see it being used for diagnoses. We also see it in a slightly less interesting form being used, albeit no less important, for tracking things like pharmaceutical regulation, and assisting people in getting their pharmaceuticals regulated in the correct way. So I think in the pharmaceutical world, AI is opening up possibilities for treatments, and for ultimately improvement to people's qualities of life, which extends quite a long way beyond certain uses of AI we see in other sectors. So I think it's being seen as generally really, really very exciting, and is developing things in the sector quite fast. But Sarah may be able to speak more to that.
Yeah, I suppose a lot of the time people go on about AI, but really they mean machine learning, and I don't know the difference. I just know, machine learning to me is more like a tool. If you've got the big data set, you can mine it and pull out some key insights, which I think is what a lot of people are doing. And certainly a lot of my clients have got big data sets. So they might be doing enzyme engineering. They'll do a load of modifications, test them, feed it back into this. That's all kind of underlying premise behind synthetic biology, really. The design, build, test, learn cycle. You do stuff, learn from it, feed it back in, and iterate on it. I think a lot of the companies, and what I hear from people, is that actually it's quite hard because you need really good data sets. So they're having to generate their own in-house data. It's not, you can't, or maybe this is something for decentralized science to look at. I don't know, like data that could be pulled together, but you can't because it's not got the right metadata, it's not formatted properly, there's a lot of stuff out there in different bits and bobs that if we could pull it together, it'd be a lot more powerful. But then, yeah, some of this will be proprietary, so my clients have their own data set. But that is another valuable form of IP that they could license out to people and let people fish around in their data for things. Yeah, I think the whole, in the pharma side, it's supposed to be kind of hope. I don't know how much of it we've seen yet, but kind of de-risking that early drug discovery phase. That was kind of the whole point, I think. But yeah.
Okay. To change gears a little bit, I would really love it, Sarah, if you could explain what evergreening patents is in the context of biotech.
Oh gosh, I think yes. Again, this is like more the big pharma guys, I suppose. But if you've got a drug, you will, and this is probably what Chris was talking about. You don't want your patent protection to run out, do you? Because it's your valuable drug. You want to keep it. As soon as your patent protection ends, generics can come into the market and undercut you, because that's it's what happens. So evergreening is kind of trying to find any new. So to get a patent granted, it has to be new and inventive. Different rules apply in different places. So in Europe, for example, it's got to be new and inventive over anything published before. In the US, your own, as a company, your own patents don't count as against you, so you don't have to be new and inventive really over your own. So I suppose this evergreen is probably easier in the US. So any little changes, it could be new formulation of the drug, just something that makes it more stable, a new use. So I don't see that as necessarily evergreening. That is a kind of a useful. If I've got a drug that can treat cancer, and then I find, oh no, I can see headaches. That to me is quite a useful new thing that somebody's discovered, and fair enough, they should perhaps have a right over that. Try to think of other example of evergreening, because it's not something I particularly work on with my clients, but yeah, they just want to extend that protection over that specific drug that's gone through all the regulatory. They spent all the money on it, and they're also trying to kind of make as much back as they can.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you were saying that you advise like early stage startups on strategy and stuff. At that point, when you are advising them and they're sort of figuring out what they can patent and how to strategically patent, these patents have a cycle of, I think, about 20 years. And do you guys plan at that early stage for what will happen at that end of that 20 years?
Probably not at the end of the 20 years. We would probably plan the next few years, hopefully. So if they're very early stage, we might be able to file on something now. They would talk about what R&D they're going to do in the next few years, and it might be, some of my clients have got like a new clever microbe, they've got a bioreactor, they've got some data. So it's figuring out what to protect and when, because they do want to protect all these different bits, and you do want to protect over time. So like we just said, that the longevity of your protection. But a lot of them are quite early in development, so you don't know what they're going to find. I'm just confident they will find something. Because nothing's as easy as you think it is. They say, right, we're going to do this, and we're going to find this thing. And sometimes that maybe feels a bit obvious because they're doing it based on what's in the literature. But you just know when they do it, it's not going to work. They're going to have to do something else that is hopefully then going to be their kind of patentable bit. 20 years' time, these companies probably won't or might not exist, or they've sold their assets to somebody. If you were thinking along the pharma side, you are probably thinking that far ahead. When are you going to go from marketing approval? You would think that ahead, all the different formulations you might want to do. But again, I guess they come up. A lot of the things come up in clinical trials. You do a clinical trial, and there's new findings in that, new indications, new patient subgroups. And again, this is probably part of an evergreening strategy, but it's also useful. So if you find your drug works better on these people and not these people, or for these people it's really toxic, that's a clever finding that is useful. You don't want to give people something that's not going to do anything for them. So yeah, maybe they deserve to get a patent. I don't know.
Yeah, I think just to add to that question about longevity in 20 years, we've just touched upon what happens if you don't get a patent. Well, you probably keep something secret instead. And one of the things we do advise clients, although less in relation to drugs, because there are regulatory reasons why you ought to file a patent. But in general, we'll talk to clients about the benefits of keeping something a trade secret over filing a patent, and that is a way you can get, provided it stays secret, you can get perpetual protection. A good example is Coca-Cola's recipe. That probably wasn't patentable in the first place, but regardless of that, they've had protection for a lot longer than 20 years by not letting anybody know what that recipe is.
Are trade secrets, I mean, is there any time limit on those? Or I'm just trying to understand like what rights trade secrets give you.
I mean, the basis of trade secrets is essentially that you keep it secret. So if you're one person and you create something, that's very easy. You just don't tell anyone what it is. If you're a company, you have procedures in place. You ensure that only the people that need to know what that secret is know it. You ensure that they can't take it away with them. You ensure that anyone you're talking to about funding, for example, is doing so under terms of confidence, et cetera, et cetera. So you take pretty stringent steps to ensure that what you're trying to keep secret remains secret. And as long as it remains secret, then there's no way for anyone else to use it because it's a secret and they don't know what it is. So the protection is literally that no one else knows what your secret is, so there's no way they can use it. The downside, the big two downsides against a patent is that a patent gives you a monopoly. So in relation to a patent, everyone knows what your invention is, but they can't use it because you have a monopoly right. Whereas a trade secret, if I have a secret and Sarah comes to the same thing independently of me, I can't stop her using it because she hasn't stolen my secret. She's just reached the same conclusion. And the second downside was if you lose your secret, if I'm trying to keep something secret and it gets let out the bag, even if I can sue the person who's let it out the bag for breach of confidence, my secret's still out the bag. If someone from Coca-Cola, by way of example, because they're the most famous example of this, if someone from Coca-Cola was to leak their recipe, that person would probably have a pretty terrible time legally, but everyone would still know the recipe.
Interesting. Chris, I would love to know, like, I feel like you would have a great opinion on sort of this difference between trade secrets and patents.
Yeah, it hits right on one of the hardest issues that we have to solve for in decentralized science, because of course the notion of being decentralized and transparent on blockchain, immediately suggests public disclosure. So what the current system is, is we want people to, for reasons also, we can get into, I think that actually connect to this, the old kind of popular logic was oftentimes write yourself your invention and mail it to yourself, so that you get the government stamp on the mail, and you've assured you have some recognition in the sealed envelope that you were in control of this idea, this trade secret, before it somehow leaked or before you wanted to get a patent. And so you have to predate if someone else had another and all this. And then some systems evolved, exactly like Mark was saying, the systems evolved to address the context. In the US, you can file provisional patents. No one reviews them. They're just a little better than that envelope to yourself because you're now in the system. And you have to teach everything that is disclosed. Exactly. The educational tool of these things, goes exactly against the trade secret point, because it's in fact, that's the public trade-off that justifies the system. So we bring this on chain, and we want to say, okay, actually, how can we just bring this on chain, make it look like the existing system, and de-risk? And what that is what happens typically is when there's a litigation around trade secret disclosure, it's the amount of public disclosure that's been made. More often than not, because all of our clients, at least in DeSci, are aware, I think, and wise to the fact that getting patents is important, even if they want to join a commons or share them, or it's market power, grab it, control it, and use it. And it doesn't have to mean you use it in the ways that are bad. You can use it well. So we're in a spot where people seem to want to move directly towards patenting. And then the dispute often becomes, later in litigation or something, was there public disclosure already? And here we're just creating timestamps, and we're creating a clear ledger with a clear NDA that applies automatically to token-gated rooms where you can kind of manage all the way down for lawyers on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, even what constitutes a sufficient NDA and what constitutes sharing with too many people in a token gated room, for it to constitute public disclosure and to still manage this. And so the tools we've created in this are to just get things on chain, default to trade secret protection with encryption, and then create a space for the natural organic information exchange to happen, but to really just tighten up and try and standardize the data, so to speak, that we would use to figure out what constitutes public disclosure. We envision some future system where hopefully you can just look on chain and be like, great, less than 200 people, this standard form NDA, this thing wasn't publicly disclosed, married out, and just try and keep these litigation costs and the disputes that arise in litigation, which if I'm a litigator and you give me one of those and I'm just doing my conventional thing, I mean, I hate to say it, I'm happy because I'm gonna crank on the bill, and maybe it does matter when these aren't there, but when the evidence is there and we can just get straight to the settlement, which tends to be the 95% outcome, if not 99%, we can go straight there and save everyone money.
I would love to know, how interoperable are IP systems from different countries? Like is this issue of US to Europe quite is it quite burdensome on people as they develop patents?
I think it's just a case of when you are drafting a patent, being aware that there are differences, mostly around. So the concept of novelty and inventive step is fairly standardized. It can be sometimes more difficult with inventive step in the US. So novelty and inventive step are similar, but it's all the main difference between the US and Europe is around what we call added subject matter. So once you've filed your application at the PCT stage, which is what most of my clients would do, you can't add anything to it. So if you can change the claims, but you can only change them based on what's written in that text. So when we write this, we have to have this kind of long-term psychic ability to think of all the things the examiners are going to throw at us, all the things you might want to do. So you might think, this is my invention, but actually I'm going to change it this way a little bit. So to build into that text all of this that we might want to use a few years in the future, which can be difficult. But in Europe, it's very hard to take different bits from that patent application and stick them together. So you might come up with let's look at an engineered microbe. You've engineered 3 different genes in one microbe. Unless we've written that quite specifically in that combination in Europe, we cannot then claim it. Whereas in the US, I think it's easier if you've just got general disclosure of those maybe different genes in the application, you can put them together. So if it was drafted from a US perspective and then transferred to Europe for like me to prosecute, and you want to kind of protect that combination, we might not be able to do it because it's just not written in the right way. Mm. But most of the other patentability things are the same. Apart from what counts as prior art is quite different in the US as well to other places.
Thank you so much for your time, for joining. I've learned so much today. It was honestly amazing. Okay, cool, everyone. Have a beautiful day.